Rare is the wine that spends more time in a barrel. Rare are the vineyards that flourish in a more harsh and unforgiving land. Rare is the grape that is harvested by hand and crushed by foot. The wine is port, and this is Ports to Remember. A discovery of port wine from the grapes to the glass. Come, savor the wine. Harvest the grapes. Get to know the place and the people whose lives have been wrapped in the joy of port wine for generations. Join your host, wine writer and connoisseur Tony Aspler in this celebration of Ports to Remember.
Welcome to the world of Sandeman. I'm Tony Aspler, your host of Ports to Remember. Join me for our program on Sandeman and the world-famous Don. Portugal is a small country. The north coast is less than 650 kilometers from the warm southern beaches. But it's a world unto itself. The city of Porto, called Porto by the British, is Portugal's second largest city. It gave rise to the names of both the nation and its most famous wine. I find the people here ambitious and industrious. They contribute more than 50% to the country's economy. There's a saying in Portugal about their cities: Coimbra studies, Braga prays, Lisbon plays, and Porto works. At Porto, the journey of the Douro River ends in the North Atlantic. It's here that port wine meets the rest of the world. Since the beginning, Porto has been the business heart of the port trade. Across the Douro River from this hub of commerce lies Vila Nova de Gaia, home of the port lodges, the offices and cellars of many of the port houses. They welcome visitors with some shade, a place to sit and enjoy a glass, and a tour. The Sandeman Lodge has been housed in this impressive building since 1813. George Sandeman is the seventh generation of the family that has guided the company for more than 200 years. On the balcony of the tasting room, above the din of the busy street, he explains where the famous Don logo came from.
Because of its fame in terms of being a company that used poster advertising, this chap called George Massiot, well actually George Massiot Brown, strangely enough another Scotsman, came to the offices at St Swithin's Lane in the City of London and presented this sort of caped and hatted figure on a rather sort of garish green-yellow background. Very, very mysterious, very eye-catching, very powerful. And they bought it at the time for 50 guineas, which was...
50 guineas, so how much would that have been?
It's difficult to relate to what that would be now, but 50 guineas, I mean, it's around 55 pounds.
Back then, 55 pounds was equivalent to a full year's salary. Still, I think it was a bargain. Today, the Don logo can be seen around Portugal and around the world. It also appears, of course, on every bottle of Sandeman Port. But more important than what's on the label is what rests behind the label. Carlos Silva has been master blender at the House of Sandeman for decades. With his practiced nose, palate, and passion, he skillfully blends the wine. Imagine these wines as infants, Carlos says. I must assess the characteristics of each and then decide how best they should be brought up. He blends as many as 8 wines from different years and vineyards to create the taste of Sandeman's Founder's Reserve Ruby. Carlos also blends an interesting port that's not as well known, a white port. George says it can take an interesting twist. one that I had never tried. George, the Sandeman Splash, what's the recipe?
Well, it's a very simple recipe. Taking the white port that Carlos made, a little bit of ice. Out of preference, I like to put a little slice of lemon in. It makes a very refreshing drink. 50%.
50% white port
and 50% tonic water. Like to try it? It's a completely different way of drinking white port, but it's
very refreshing. Wonderful for a summer day. Sandeman Splash. The building that houses the tasting room is more than 200 years old, and it's filled with art and artifacts, the history of the family with their wine. George Sandeman tells the story that one of his family members was advised by his doctor that he could only drink 1 glass of port a day. So he had this glass made and the decanter to match. And just to give you a sense of size, this is what an ordinary port glass looks like. Stay with me. When Ports to Remember returns, we'll be guests at the intronization ceremony of the Confraria de Vino de Porto, the Brotherhood of Port. For centuries, the Douro River carried wine from the quintas, the farms and their vineyards, to Porto. Trains and trucks have replaced that tradition, but new ones have arisen. Each year since, under the watchful eye of Henry the Navigator, the Palacio de Bolsa echoes with the intronization ceremony. The construction of this beautiful Baroque building began in 1842 and took 60 years. Like the other palacios here, it was built not for kings, but for commerce. Mind you, one would be hard-pressed to find more regal surroundings. This library is magnificent. The skill of the craftsmen and artists who built and decorated these rooms is truly awesome. The intronization ceremony itself takes place in the Hall of Nations. The intronization of 50 new members of the Brotherhood of Port is about to take place. These men and women are being honored for their contribution to the port trade in Portugal and around the world. The attire of the Confraria evokes the heraldry of the port trade. The green and red on the ribbon are the colors of Portugal's flag. The dramatic red robe is embroidered with the crest of the Confraria below the shoulder. The black hat is a copy of the one worn by Infante Don Enrique, Henry the Navigator. He's the patron of the Brotherhood. The tabuladeira, attached to the end of the ribbon, dates back to the 17th century. It's a replica of the cup once used to taste wine in the cellars. Until recently, there were no women in this brotherhood. But times have changed. A few days after her intronization into the Brotherhood of Port, Ligia Marx of the House of Sandeman showed me a couple of the ways to open port bottles. When opening a very old vintage port, the use of tongs is more than just a ceremony. Okay, so let's get to it.
Well,
I'm going to stand back.
So we need to place the heated tongs around the neck of the bottle. And allow the heat to pass to the glass. This is very good for very old wines, again, because they risk along the years to have the corks glued to the neck of the bottle. And so with this process, we avoid having the sediments.
And now the ice goes on, and it's that contrast of heat and cold that causes the crack in the glass.
Yes.
Aha!
Did you hear it?
That characteristic crack. Now, is this perfectly safe? You're not going to get any glass splinters?
Usually not, because if you had all the heat around the bottle, usually it's a clean cut.
Ah, bravo. And there it is. Port tongs are fun, particularly dramatic at a candlelit table, but they're rarely necessary. In all the years I've been drinking port, I've only had to use them once. Decanting, on the other hand, is very important. Vintage ports should always be decanted. Inevitably, the wine throws a sediment, and you don't want that in your glass. I'm back here at Sandeman with Licia Marx, who's going to show us how to actually decant a bottle of port properly. In this one, we have taken the cork out with a corkscrew, not with the tongue. Licia, basically, what do we need to decant an old bottle of port?
Well, basically you need the bottle of your choice, a decanter to transfer the wine, some extra glasses that might come in handy, a candle eventually, something to clean your hands.
Decanting is a careful process. Licia holds the bottle very still so as not to disturb the sediment. She pours the last of the port into 3 glasses. The first 2 have no sediment. The last, as you can see, is quite muddy, with tannin and grape bits that have settled in the bottom of the bottle. You can hear it plopping out there, all the sediment, big pieces of grape skin, and everything. Look how cloudy and dark that is.
So against the candlelight, you check if that wine is okay. You put it,
and if it is, it goes back into the decanter.
The decanter. This also, it's
Yes.
okay. You can put it into the decanter. If you would keep on decanting right to the decanter, you would ruin your clean wine.
Look how wonderfully ruby colored it is. And that is a beautifully clean, decanted bottle of Sandeman Vintage 1982, just ready to be consumed.
A port to remember.
A port to remember. Stay with me. When Ports to Remember returns, we'll travel up the Douro River to where the port grapes grow. Porto is a modern and cosmopolitan city. For all its contemporary elegance, the long history of Porto remains a vital part of life today. Narrow cobbled streets are lined with tall medieval buildings leaning together for mutual support. Their wrought iron balconies are always festooned with daily washing. In a part of town with a more recent history, I visited a world-renowned landmark, the Majestic Cafe. I'm sitting here in the Majestic Cafe in downtown Porto. It's here that the locals come for a glass of port in the afternoon. They can go downstairs and see the art exhibition as well. Wow, excellent. Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Obrigado. A glass of tawny in the afternoon. cafes and dining rooms in Porto would not be out of place in any sophisticated European city. But not far out of town, the modern world becomes a distant shore. Upstream in the hills overlooking the Douro River, the 20th century is only a thin patina over the life that has not changed for generations. The men sit over a glass and discuss important things. The women, always busy, share the news. One woman told me that work was in the vineyards. Other than that, she said, there is only life. Early the next day, Ligia Marx and I take to the water, heading up the Douro River to Quinta de Val, one of the jewels of Sandeman's properties. Every bend of the river opens the curtain on another vista. We see villages that have hardly changed in centuries. But the 20th century still makes itself known, occasionally at least. We head towards the heartland of the Alto Douro, the upper reaches of the river. 24,000 square kilometers have been dedicated to viticulture here. Thank you. Quinta do Val covers less than 30 hectares. But when this quinta is fully planted, its grapes will produce 34,000 cases of port each year. The vines grow in great sweeping curves that have been carved out of the rocky valley walls. In the blazing autumn sunshine, I'm amazed yet again that this harsh and inhospitable ground can produce the grapes to make such a wonderful wine. Perhaps it is the sweat of the farmer that nourishes this land. The people in the Douro bend to their tasks from first light to dusk and well into the night, always ready with a smile or ready to share a joke, but still focused on what has to be done. Work doesn't stop for the weather, it never has. Before the invention of plastic raincoats, workers in the vineyards wore straw.
And it's like thatch, and it keeps the workers dry, it keeps them warm, and if they perspire, it doesn't actually hold in the perspiration. So this is a very smart outfit, and it is still used here in the Douro by workers in the fields during the winter and by shepherds.
There is lush green in this hard river valley. Quinta Santa Clara is one of the oases. The gardens are a welcome respite. Here, Ligia Marx shows me the answer to the question, must we always drink port by itself? The resounding answer is no. The meal of quiche made with Portuguese blue cheese, a pork tenderloin, followed by a chocolate mousse, was all prepared with, or paired nicely with, port.
Now, chocolate is perhaps the most difficult thing to match with wine, and we've probably found the answer here. Chocolate with a late bottled vintage port. That is absolutely delicious. Mind you, I love chocolate.
And port.
Yeah,
New
that
ports
too.
for chocolate.
That too.
Sated, well, perhaps a little too sated, Ligia Marx and I head back to Porto and the lodges. Stay with me. Ports to Remember will be right back. The cellars at the Sandeman Lodge in Villanova de Gaia are cool and dark. Here, George Sandeman and I walk through the quiet where the port wine awaits its time. Although these particular bottles are relatively young, time has been performing its miracles here for generations. Port wine has reached maturity in these cellars through war and peaceful times since 1813. Among these ancient timbers, the dust of ages, and the bouquets of port and wood, I asked George Sandeman about how he enjoys port wine.
But probably the most usual and a good one at home is chocolate with a late bottled vintage port.
Now, for somebody who wants to get into port, what advice would you give to the beginner?
I think start with a wine made by a reputable house, because it gives you a standard of quality, and start with a ruby port, late bottled vintage or a reserve wine, and then move on from there.
In this part of the cellar, I noticed that the floor is much softer underfoot.
This is wood.
They're wooden blocks made out of the staves of the vats.
Why would you do that?
We lay them down here when we roll the pipes around, it protects them, because it's wood on wood as opposed to wood on stone, so it keeps them in better condition.
Under the watchful gaze of the ubiquitous Don, we talk about the aging of port in small barrels. These barrels are called pipes. They allow more contact between the wine and wood than larger vats. This means that higher levels of oxidation occur, and consequently, the ruby color changes to amber. The wine in these pipes is destined to become tawny port. The Douro River rolls by the Sandeman Lodge. The sun beats down, and the noisy business of the city continues above. But here, in the quiet, we walk in the midst of a sum of many skills, the culmination of craftsmanship waiting to see the light again, as it has for generations.
When it comes to tasting port, whatever the color, the same principle applies. Have a look at the color. Beautiful, rich color it is. Give the wine a swirl, because this releases the wine's bouquet. Give it a sniff, and then take some in the mouth, let it wash over the entire palate. And that's how to enjoy port. You've been watching Ports to Remember. Join me for the next program in the series.